I didn't break my silence because I suddenly became brave. I broke it because the men who ordered that silence are mostly gone now, and the building where it all started still exists, even though it was never supposed to. If you search the records, you won't find the hangar I'm talking about. It doesn't appear on base maps. It was never assigned a number that civilians could see. But I stood inside it. My name is Richard J. Wolfe, former United States Air Force. Not an officer, not a strategist, just a man trained to follow instructions, move equipment, and keep his mouth shut. For most of my service, that was enough. Then one night they sent us to a structure that technically wasn't there. It sat on the far end of the airfield, past the maintenance sector, beyond the rows of standard storage buildings where aircraft parts were usually kept. The road leading to it had no sign. The lights were deliberately dim. Even the perimeter fencing looked older than the rest of the phone base, as if someone wanted it to blend into the background of forgotten infrastructure. But the security was wrong. You learn to read those things when you're in the service long enough. The number of guards, the spacing of vehicles, the way people avoid eye contact. That night, the guards weren't protecting something from getting out. They were protecting it from being seen. There were 6 of us in the truck when we arrived. None of us had been told what the assignment actually was. That wasn't unusual. In the Air Force, you learn quickly that information moves downward only when someone decides you deserve it. We were told one thing: equipment transfer. That was the phrase, neutral, forgettable. But when the hangar doors opened, I remember the first thing that struck me wasn't what was inside. It was the smell. Not fuel, not hydraulic fluid, not anything that belonged in an aircraft facility. It was metallic, almost sterile, like cold rain hitting hot steel. And there was another scent underneath it that I've never been able to name. Something dry, ancient maybe, like air that had been sealed away for a very long time. Inside the hangar, the lighting was low and focused downward. They didn't illuminate the ceiling. That meant shadows covered most of the upper structure. If you wanted to see the full height of the building, you had to strain your eyes. I remember thinking that was intentional. Then I saw the object. At first, my brain refused to process it. You expect certain shapes in a military hangar. Fuselage sections, wings, engines on stands. This thing had none of those. It was resting on a support frame that clearly hadn't been designed for it. The frame looked improvised, like something engineers assembled quickly to stabilize a load they didn't fully understand. The craft itself, if that's even the right word, was smooth in a way that didn't make sense. No rivets, no seams, no panels. The surface reflected the overhead lights, but not like polished metal. It was softer than that, almost fluid. When you stared at it too long, the reflection seemed to shift slightly, like heat distortion over asphalt. One of the technicians standing near it noticed us staring. He didn't raise his voice. He just said something quietly that I've never forgotten. "Don't touch anything unless we tell you." Nobody had tried to touch it, but he said it anyway. That was when I realized something important. Everyone inside that hangar already knew what it was. Everyone, except the 6 of us who had just walked in. We were there to move crates, large, sealed containers that had arrived hours earlier under armed escort. They were lined up near the wall, each one marked with inventory codes that meant absolutely nothing to me. But the scientists, if that's what they were, handled them with a kind of careful tension I had never seen before. Not fear exactly, more like controlled awareness. Like they were standing next to something that could rewrite the rules they had spent their entire careers studying, and maybe it already had. No one explained the craft. No one acknowledged it. The orders were simple: unload the containers, stack them near the central platform, and leave. That's the strange part about military operations most civilians don't understand. You can stand 10 feet away from the most important discovery in human history and still be treated like a forklift operator, which is exactly what we were. I remember circling the support platform while carrying one of the crates. That's when I saw the underside of the craft. There were no landing gears, no obvious propulsion ports. Instead, there were shallow indentations across the surface, almost like geometric impressions pressed into soft metal before it hardened. They weren't symmetrical in the way human engineering usually is. They looked purposeful, but not designed for us to understand. I didn't ask questions. None of us did. Because in places like that, questions have consequences. But one thought kept repeating in the back of my mind the entire time we worked inside that hangar. If this was a recovered aircraft, why wasn't anyone talking about where it came from? And if it wasn't an aircraft, then what exactly had we just been ordered to stand next to? And more importantly, why did the Air Force already have a building ready for it? The thing about classified work is that people imagine it's loud, sirens, urgency, men shouting orders. Most of the time it's the opposite: silence, controlled voices, measured steps, people pretending that what they're seeing is perfectly ordinary. That hangar ran on silence. We finished moving the crates in less than an hour. No one rushed us, but no one wasted time either. Every person inside that building moved with the quiet discipline you see in surgical rooms. Not military discipline, something different. These were scientists, engineers, civilian specialists who had been pulled into something they didn't talk about outside those walls. You could tell by the way they looked at the craft, not with curiosity, with calculation. Like they had already spent days trying to understand it and were now slowly realizing the rules they relied on might not apply anymore. I remember setting down the final crate near a long work table covered in instruments. None of the equipment looked experimental. Oscilloscopes, measurement arrays, scanning rigs, the kind of devices you'd find in any advanced research facility. Human tools. And that contrast stayed with me. Human tools, trying to interrogate something that clearly hadn't been built by human hands. One of the engineers opened a container while we were still in the room. The lid came off slowly, almost ceremonially. Inside was a set of sensor arrays, compact units with long fiber, cables and mounting brackets. I didn't know what they were for at the time, but I watched where they carried them, straight to the underside of the craft. That's when something unusual happened. The moment those instruments came close to the surface, the air inside the hangar changed. I don't mean temperature or pressure, nothing physical you could measure with a gauge. More like a subtle tension spreading through the room. Every conversation stopped. The engineers leaned closer. One of them placed a probe against the hull, and the reading devices on the table immediately reacted. Lights flickered, needles jumped. A low electronic tone came from one of the monitors. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then everything stabilized. But in those 3 seconds, I saw something in the engineers' faces. Not excitement, recognition. The kind of recognition that comes when a theory you barely believed might be true suddenly stops being theoretical. One of the men whispered something to the others. I couldn't hear the whole sentence, but 2 words carried across the hangar. Still active. That phrase sat in my mind for years. Still active. Active means operating, functioning, alive in some sense. But the craft had been sitting motionless on that frame since before we arrived. No engines running, no visible power source, no movement. And yet their instruments had just told them something inside it was doing something. That's when the senior officer stepped in. I hadn't noticed him before because he stayed near the entrance most of the time. Colonel rank from the insignia, older than the rest of us. The kind of man who had spent decades in classified environments. He watched the engineers for a long moment before speaking. "Document the readings," he said. His voice was calm. "Nothing leaves this room without clearance." Nobody argued. One of the scientists nodded and began writing notes on a clipboard. Another adjusted the probe placement, slower this time, as if he expected the surface to react again. But it didn't. The monitors stayed steady, just numbers, quiet data scrolling across green screens. We were told to leave shortly after that. No debrief, no instructions about what we had seen, just a simple order from the same colonel as we walked toward the truck. You were never here. Not a threat, not even delivered harshly, just a fact. And that's how these things work in the military. The system doesn't need to scare you. It just reminds you where you stand inside it. You follow orders. You forget what you saw. Life moves on. At least that's what they expect. But as we drove away from that hangar, one of the guys in the back of the truck finally spoke. He had been quiet the entire time inside. The kind of quiet that usually means someone is thinking very carefully. He leaned toward me and said something I didn't answer then, and still don't have a clean answer for now. He said, "If that thing is still active, who turned it off?" And that question stayed with me, because the more I thought about it over the years, the more I realized that might not have been the right question at all. The real question was something much harder to face. What if no one ever turned it off in the first place? In the Air Force, paperwork is its own kind of camouflage. People imagine secrets are protected by locked vaults and armed guards. Sometimes they are, but more often the real protection comes from the way things are written down, or the way they aren't. After that night in the hangar, our unit received a short administrative briefing. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet reminder about operational discretion. Standard language about unauthorized discussion of classified activity. It wasn't the first time we had heard that speech, but the difference was what came next. Each of us had to sign a document confirming we had participated in a logistics transfer involving restricted aerospace materials. That was the exact wording, restricted aerospace materials. That phrase covered a lot of ground. A damaged satellite could be restricted aerospace material. A prototype aircraft component could do the same thing. Even a piece of classified radar equipment might fall under that category. But the craft in that hangar, it didn't belong to any category I had ever seen in my service. Still, the paperwork treated it like spare parts. That's how the system keeps itself clean. You reduce the impossible into ordinary language, and suddenly the record looks harmless. I signed the form. So did the others. None of us spoke about the craft during that process. Not openly. Not even with the officer supervising the paperwork. It was as if an unspoken rule had already settled over us. You don't describe what you saw, because if you describe it, you acknowledge it was real, and that brings attention you don't want. A few weeks passed. Life returned to routine operations, aircraft maintenance, equipment transport. Long hours filled with tasks that made sense in the normal world. But every once in a while, something small would remind me of that hangar. A transport convoy arriving late at night. A sealed container moving through a part of the base that usually stayed quiet. New civilian technicians appearing without explanation. Those moments had a certain pattern. They always happened after midnight, and they always involved that same remote sector of the base, the hangar without a number. I only went back inside it once. That wasn't part of the original assignment. In fact, I wasn't supposed to be anywhere near it that night. But logistics work sometimes sends you down roads you didn't plan to take. A maintenance vehicle had broken down near the outer perimeter road. I was part of the recovery crew sent to retrieve it. While we were hooking the tow rig, I noticed something strange. The hangar lights were fully on, brighter than the night we had first entered, and the main doors were partially open. From where we stood, I could see maybe 20 feet inside the building, just enough to catch movement. There were more people this time, not just engineers. I recognized 2 individuals wearing medical scrubs beneath their lab coats. That stuck with me because it didn't make sense. Medical personnel inside an aerospace analysis facility. And I saw the platform. The craft was still there, but the support frame had been modified. Larger braces had been added around the lower section, almost like a cage built to hold something stable while it was being examined. and near the front portion of the hull, a section of the surface had changed. I want to be careful with my words here, because I didn't see anyone cutting into the craft. I didn't see tools penetrating the structure, but I did see an opening that hadn't been there before. Not a jagged hole, not damage, an aperture. Smooth, rounded, like part of the craft itself had shifted to reveal an interior space, and the light coming from inside it wasn't coming from any lamp I recognized. It was soft, diffused, almost like the glow of deep water. One of the technicians leaned partially inside the opening while holding a sensor wand. Another stood behind him reading data from a handheld device. The medical staff watched closely. Nobody looked comfortable. I remember standing there longer than I should have, pretending to adjust a cable on the tow rig while my eyes kept drifting back toward the hangar. At one point, the technician inside the aperture suddenly pulled back. Not violently, just quickly. The man holding the scanner said something that made two of the scientists step closer. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the expression on their faces. Concern, not panic, not fear. Something quieter. The kind of concern you see when people realize they're interacting with a system they don't fully control. A moment later, the hangar doors began to close, slowly at first, then faster. And just before the opening disappeared from view, I had a final glimpse of the inside of that craft. There were no wires, no control panels, no seats, nothing that looked like the interior of a vehicle, just curved surfaces and a faint pulsing glow moving beneath them, like light traveling through translucent stone. That image stayed with me longer than anything else I saw during my service, because it forced me to accept something I had been trying not to think about. If that object was a machine, it wasn't built the way humans build machines. And if it wasn't a machine, then what exactly had the Air Force recovered? And why did they suddenly need medical personnel standing beside it? There's a moment in every long silence when you realize it was never really about secrecy. It was about isolation. The system doesn't need to threaten you. It doesn't even need to watch you that closely. All it has to do is make sure you understand one thing very clearly. No one else is going to confirm what you saw. That realization came years after my service ended, but the seed of it started the night I saw the interior of that craft. After the hangar doors closed, our recovery crew finished towing the disabled vehicle and left the area. No one mentioned what we had glimpsed through the opening. Not in the truck, not back at the maintenance bay. It was like the whole thing had been quietly erased the moment the doors shut. But something changed inside me after that. Not curiosity. I had already learned curiosity was dangerous in places like that. It was something heavier. Awareness. Once you've seen something that doesn't fit into the world you thought you understood, the ordinary parts of life start to look slightly different. I began noticing how carefully information moved around the base. Certain people appeared only in specific buildings. Certain vehicles never parked in the general motor pool. Certain shipments arrived without documentation passing through the usual channels. And once you notice patterns like that, you can't stop seeing them. Months went by before I heard anything directly connected to the craft again. The information didn't come from an officer. It came from a technician. He was a civilian contractor assigned to equipment diagnostics. We had crossed paths a few times before. Quiet guy, mid-40s maybe. The kind of man who spent more time listening than talking. One evening we ended up alone in a break room near the maintenance sector. Late shift. Coffee that had been sitting on the burner too long. He looked tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep. We talked about ordinary things at first, equipment issues, supply delays, routine complaints that keep people sane during long postings. Then the conversation drifted. He asked me a strange question. Did you ever work logistics in the outer hangars? The way he said it told me he already knew the answer. I didn't respond right away. In the Air Force, silence is often the safest reply. But after a moment I nodded. Just once. That was enough. He stared into his coffee for a long time before speaking again. They thought it was dormant, he said quietly. Not they think, past tense, thought. I didn't ask him what he meant. He didn't volunteer the full story. But over the next few minutes, pieces of something slipped out between his sentences. The probe readings we had seen that first night hadn't been a fluke. The internal systems inside the craft, whatever those systems were, had never completely powered down. The engineers couldn't identify a power source. They couldn't find circuitry. But certain instruments kept detecting structured energy patterns moving through the hull. Not random radiation, patterns. Repeating sequences that looked almost organized, like signals traveling through a nervous system. At first they assumed it was residual energy from whatever propulsion method the craft had used. And something changed. The patterns started responding to external stimuli, touch, electromagnetic scans, even the presence of certain biological materials. That last part is why medical personnel had been brought in. I remember asking him one question. It slipped out before I could stop myself. Responding how? He looked up at me then, and I saw something in his face that made the room feel colder. Not fear, resignation. Like a man who had spent too long staring at a problem that had no comfortable explanation. They stopped calling it a vehicle, he said. That sentence hung in the air between us. I didn't ask what they called it instead. Part of me already suspected, and part of me didn't want to hear the words spoken out loud. He finished his coffee, stood up, and said something else before leaving the room, a sentence that stayed with me for decades. They were never trying to reverse engineer it. He paused at the doorway. They were trying to figure out if it was waiting. Waiting. For what? For someone to turn it back on? For someone to come back for it? Or for something inside it to wake up on its own? That's the part you won't find in any report. Not the logistics documents. Not the classified briefings. Because some discoveries don't create answers. They create questions that no institution on Earth is prepared to explain. And the more years I spent carrying that memory, the more one possibility kept returning to me. What if the reason that hangar was so carefully hidden wasn't because of what the Air Force had recovered, but because of what the craft might eventually do?